This lesson is an introduction to Haroun and the Sea of Stories. And in this lesson, I want to give you some definitions and examples of historical and political allegory, the Bildungsroman, and farce. And then at the end, I want to glue it all together for you to show you the context and author's purpose and give you some insights into the background of Salman Rushdie and some pointers on how to read the book. So let's begin. So first of all, allegory, right? An allegory is any story, poem, or other work of art that is highly or even completely symbolic or full of symbols. And this is usually symbolic of some psychological or spiritual journey or process. Allegory works better when something is very abstract and hard to represent in realistic terms. And the painting here is an allegory of life and death and disease and suffering and warfare, this kind of traditional European allegorical painting. A lot of the early allegories in English literature were religious in nature because so much of Christianity can't really be represented in concrete terms. It's all kind of abstract. The process of sin and temptation and guilt and repentance. That's all hard to represent literally, so allegory is very common in traditional English literature from like the Renaissance and the medieval period, and this painting is another example of that. Let's look at some examples of political and historical allegory that you might be familiar with. The image on the top here is from Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. And when that movie first came out, a lot of people saw it as allegory of George W. Bush's dishonesty. I'm perhaps giving too much of my opinion here, I'm sorry, but Bush's duplicity and dishonesty in the run-up to the Iraq War, right? You have this legislature, in this case the Galactic Senate, that is under the sway of a very charming and charismatic leader who is telling them a bunch of lies and leading them into a war that they have no business going into. A lot of people saw that as an allegory of George W. Bush's claims about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Another, historical or political allegory is the movie 300. When that movie came out, the United States was also embroiled in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And a lot of people looked at this movie and said, here are the Greeks led by Leonidas of Sparta, the good-looking white heroes who represent Western culture, Western culture being that of Europe and North America and all of Europe's former colonies, right? So Leonidas represents, the goodness of Western civilization and democracy and brotherhood versus, Xerxes, who represents Persia, which is modern-day Iran, the Muslim world, right? And this kind of dark, sinister, idolatrous, grim, hierarchical people. And, people looked at 300 and saw it as an allegory of the conflict between the West and Islam in the early 2000s. Right, so why allegory? Why do artists and authors even create allegory? Well, they do it for a couple of reasons. First is to represent the abstract, the spiritual, or the psychological, and I mentioned that in a moment ago, or to avoid offending, right? Sometimes an author wants to say something that is potentially offensive, and they hide it underneath this allegory to kind of protect the innocent. And this is done sometimes for very good, honest, nice reasons. The other side of that is to avoid censorship and or prosecution, right? You can't come right out and criticize the government directly, or they'll put you in chains or kill you or burn your books, as we see here. So you create this allegory where it's like, no, I'm not talking about the president. I'm not talking about the leader. It's all cool. This is, just a story about bunny rabbits. Yeah, that's it. And we're going to see that in Haroun and the Sea of Stories, that it is an allegory that Rushdie wrote to represent the very harsh prosecution and persecution that he was under at the hands of the Iranian government. Haroun and the Sea of Stories is also a Bildungsroman, and that's a fancy German word that just means it's a coming-of-age narrative. And like all good coming-of-age narratives, it has a hero or a kind of chosen one who goes through an epiphany. Usually in Bildungsromans, the protagonist hero has some kind of epiphany about who they really are or what they're really capable of. Mulan has this, epiphany about her ability to save her people and save her family. Luke Skywalker doesn't even know he's the chosen one until Obi-Wan Kenobi tells him. So there's that epiphany element that goes back to the Epiphanies unit that we did at the beginning of the year. And finally, there is this, the hero comes to either heal or save the community. And we see that in both the Bildungsromans in front of us here. So, Haroun and the Sea of Stories is a Bildungsroman, right? The main character's father has lost his power of stories. And Haroun and his father are going to have to go into this fantastical moon of the world. It's not our moon, it's a different moon, and it's this fantastic setting in which Haroun is going to be tested and will eventually become the hero and save everyone in his moon and in our world. And throughout it, though, the book is a farce. And a farce is a story that is silly to the point of being absurd. You might be familiar with Walt Disney's Alice in Wonderland. That's a farce. It's a farcical representation of the Wars of the Roses, right, between the Tudors and the Yorks during the early Renaissance period of English history. And farces can be satirical in nature. They use that exaggeration, and very often farces are allegorical attacks on very serious or deadly, powerful individuals and groups. And sometimes we create farces to lessen the power of those groups, to make those groups less scary or those individuals less scary. And so I have these comics here of Osama bin Laden, right, and kind of making fun of him to make him seem less serious and less powerful. If you're familiar with Dr. Seuss, right, Green Eggs and Ham and Cat in the Hat and stuff, Seuss has made all kinds of farcical comics about Adolf Hitler during World War II, and they're great. You can go look them up. They're hilarious. Go check them out on Google Images or something. All right, so let's put this all together, right? The allegory, the Bildungsroman, the farce, and let's look at the context in which Salman Rushdie wrote Haroun and the Sea of Stories, right? Because in 1988, Rushdie published the Satanic Verses, which itself is a kind of silly allegory, but it makes the suggestion that part of the Quran was inspired by Satan. Those are the so-called Satanic Verses of the Quran, and this, as you can imagine, was deeply offensive to Muslims. And in 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme ruler of Iran, ordered a fatwa against Salman Rushdie. And a fatwa is just an order from a religious leader in Islam, but it was a death order, right? I mean, Khomeini ordered any believing Muslim anywhere in the world to kill Rushdie on sight, no warning, no trial, take him out. This was serious business. I mean, Rushdie had attempts made on his life. He ended up going into hiding in London for about 10 years, and it got so bad that the English government or the British government broke off ties with Iran. They took this very seriously. All sides took this very seriously. In fact, in an interview from Der Spiegel magazine, Rushdie said, the first thing police officers told me was that I needed an alias in order to make possible certain practical things. Secret houses had to be rented, and I needed a fake bank account and had to write checks. And later on in the interview, the interviewer from Der Spiegel says, so in your case, there was Joe, the man your bodyguards were protecting. And indeed, Rushdie had armed bodyguards with him 24/7 for 10 years to protect him from agents of the Iranian government as well as fanatical Muslims who wanted to kill him. And continuing, he said, the Der Spiegel says, then there was Joseph Anton, who rented houses and signed checks. This was Rushdie's alias. And then there was Rushdie, the troublemaker, and Salman was the writer who sat alone in his hiding place. It's enough to drive a person crazy. And Rushdie responds, it was indeed crazy. There was a huge gulf between public perception and my own private truth. And to a degree, Haroun in the Sea of Stories is a crazy book, and there is a gulf between our reality and the reality of the book. Like I said, it's a crazy story. It's one of the things that makes it so awesome. Because at bottom, Haroun in the Sea of Stories is a children's book. It's a farce. To me, it reminds me of Alice in Wonderland. But it is, underneath all of that, a political, allegorical attack on censorship and on repressive societies such as Iran. And Rushdie chose to write this as a children's book in honor of his son, right? In 1989, when Rushdie went into hiding, his son Zafar, who we see here next to his father, Zafar is the one with the hair. Zafar lost out on 10 years of life with his father, right? I mean, Rushdie's often hiding and separated from his family for their own protection. And, his boy lost out on 10 years. And so, the novel itself is dedicated to Zafar, as we'll see on the dedication page. And so to a degree, Rushdie wrote this, to kind of honor the time that he lost with his own child. And Rushdie started the book in 1990, right, a year after the fatwa. And you can see, very much, Rushdie is the old storyteller Rashid in the book. And so I want to leave you here with some essential questions that come out of the book. And these will be topics for discussion in class. These will also be some possible writing assignments that I'm going to give you. The first one here is a quote from the book itself. Haroun says it, as do some of the other characters. It acts as a kind of refrain in the early chapters of the book. It says, what's the use of stories that aren't even true, right? Why do we tell ourselves fictional stories? And what good are they anyways? You can't build bridges out of them. You can't fix cars with stories. Why make them? And where do stories come from, and what inspires us? As we're going to see, Haroun's father, Rashid, loses his power to tell stories when his mother runs off with a very practical man who has no business with stories. And because of that, Rashid is no longer able to tell stories. He's lost his inspiration. And you think about popular culture and popular art, right? How many songs have been written for the love of a woman, right? I love her. She doesn't love me. She ran off. She took my truck and my dog, right? I mean, where's that inspiration coming from? And, Rushdie's going to ask us, is there such a thing as toxic culture, right? In the book, the Sea of Stories is being poisoned. Is something like a repressive culture in Iran or contemporary North Korea, are those toxic cultures? And can those toxic cultures infect the rest of us? Or if maybe I'll pick on, I love to pick on Wiz Khalifa. I can't stand his music. Or someone like Britney Spears. Is that toxic culture, right? Do we want our children to drink the culture of Britney Spears and Wiz Khalifa and Kim Kardashian and Honey Boo Boo? Do we really want our kids to grow up like that, or is that toxic culture? Rushdie's also going to ask us, how does a hero emerge and what choices do they make? Rushdie became a kind of hero in the world for standing up to the Iranian government. And then finally, as we'll see at the end of this book, how are egalitarian societies where everybody is equal and gets along and is kind of on the same level, how are egalitarian societies more powerful than repressive, hierarchical ones? And the forces of light and darkness are going to meet in this book, and you're going to see that the forces of light are very democratic and loose and open, kind of like modern American culture where it seems like nobody's in charge sometimes in modern America versus, these repressive hierarchical cultures where there's clearly someone in charge who's dominating everyone and everybody's afraid to speak their minds. That's the way the bad guys are in this novel, in the same as, modern repressive societies like Iran or Saudi Arabia or North Korea. Because as we look around the world today, the more open and egalitarian a society is, the more successful it seems to be in terms of wealth and happiness and health and violence and things like that. So, I think Rushdie's also asking us some questions about that. And so that's it. Thanks for watching.